The vintage Carl Zeiss 135mm is a medium telephoto lens, but is it worth using on modern Sony mirrorless cameras? Sony has a few options in the 135mm focal range, whether that's primed or zoomed. They all produce amazing images, but they come with a very expensive, amazing price. So is it possible that the Carl Zeiss 135mm vintage lens could be used as a budget option? Stick with me to find out. The Carl Zeiss 135mm is an f2.8 lens. The one I'm shooting with has a contact Yashica mount, and given that this lens does not have any electronics in it, it is all manual focusing and the aperture is set on the lens. At the time of recording this, good copies seem to be in the $125 to $250 range US. This makes this lens very affordable. To truly determine if this lens is a good option compared to the other more modern 135mm lenses, we need to take a look at the images that it produces. Anytime I get a new vintage lens, the first thing I do is take a test shot to make sure that it's sharp. You can see here with this image that the Carl Zeiss 135mm on the Sony A7 II is definitely sharp. This is a raw image converted to JPEG with no sharpening. This lens is definitely sharp, and even at f2.8, it is still sharp in the corners. The 135mm has always been known as a great portrait or headshot lens. So let's take a look at how the Carl Zeiss 135mm does. With this image, you can see that this lens does very well with portraits. The shallow depth of field at f2.8 is really nice. See that the right eye is in focus and the model's necklace is soft. This really surprised me because I'm used to seeing the shallower depth of field in faster primes, more like f1.8 or f1.4. So far, this lens is performing very well. This next image shows the shallow depth of field again. The letters on the tire are in focus, and as you go further under the truck, you can see it gets softer and softer. This is great shallow depth of field. Even though the Carl Zeiss 135mm has really good shallow depth of field, it still does not hold up to the faster primes that I've used in the past. Even though the 135mm focal length is considered a portrait lens, it can be used for so many other things. This image is a tight landscape of the leaves of a Joshua tree and a small amount of contrasting blue sky in the background. By using the 135mm instead of a wider focal length, I was able to separate the foreground from the background and really make the leaves the focal point of the image. This next image is a still life of a cactus arrangement. It is another great example of how to isolate the subject from the background. The image also shows again how sharp this lens is, and I really like the colors and micro contrast. This has a feel to it that I don't see with modern lenses that are more neutral color-wise. It's a great example of how a vintage lens can produce an image with a little bit different feel, and this is really great for someone that's trying to be creative. Again, with this next still life style image, we see amazing colors and this lens doing a good job isolating the orange and blurring the background slightly. With that, the next image is from the same set of shots. I was trying to focus on the oranges, but missed the focus. I will stress here that this is a manual focus lens, and I am really comfortable manually focusing, but I never get 100% focus on all of the images that I take, and I shoot with manual lenses a lot. But what I did notice is with this Carl Zeiss 135mm, I did miss focus more than usual and more than I'm used to. I'm going to talk about the manual focus a little more here. Given that the 135mm is a medium telephoto lens, I find myself using it a lot with subjects that move, whether this is portraits or pets. Here you can see that when successful, this lens takes great images with the dog standing here. This was at sunrise and the warm light is very much representative of the scene at the time I took the image. Unfortunately, the dog is looking at a ball that is right out of the frame and the head is not in a great position. This next image shows the dog in a much more pleasing pose, but the focus is off just a bit as the focal plane is more around the dog's chest. With moving subjects, this is really difficult to control, and I found myself really wanting an autofocus lens here to take these pictures. I will also add that what if this was a wedding or an event or something like that where things were constantly moving and you had a client that expected images. This would not be ideal. I really want to like the vintage Carl Zeiss 135mm lens. It takes great images. I really like the Carl Zeiss color and contrast, and I really like the images it produces. With that said, unfortunately, this lens will not end up in my vintage lens bag. I just missed too many shots, especially with the dog out running around with this lens. This just would not have happened with a modern lens with autofocus. My recommendation for a medium telephoto lens like the 135mm would be to save up the money for a modern autofocus lens. Now, I know that that's hard to say because it's the difference between a vintage lens being $200 and a modern lens that is around $1,700. I think the price is worth it because if I have a client that I miss shots on, it costs me not only the money that I got paid for that gig, but it also hurts my reputation, and that difference in price is really worth it. What are your thoughts on this lens based on the images? Leave me a comment, like, subscribe, and enjoy your photography journey. And watch this to see how the vintage Carl Zeiss 28mm performed on the Sony A7 II mirrorless camera.